Right, I'm gonna start with the ad because inevitably I'm going to refer to this a little bit. This is my latest, greatest work. Came out a few months ago. It's a little pen and sword history. So it's part history, part battlefield guidebook, as this type of series are. Absolutely full of the detail of what I'm going to cover today. In fact, just trying to work out how to pitch this talk, and knowing that there are going to be a lot of people on the talk who don't know much about this particular area at all, I'm keeping it at a fairly high level rather than going down to real nitty-gritty detail. So if you want nitty-gritty detail, it's a lot of it is in the book. And there aren't many English language books covering this subject at all. It does get a little bit of coverage in official histories and stuff like that, the odd regimental history, but mainly because there are no British forces involved in most of this area, you don't tend to get too much English language coverage. So that was really what drove me to put that little book together. So I'm going to start by explaining what I mean by the Yser Front at all. I'm going to start with a few photographs from the battlefields. This is a little chapel. It's a chapel dedicated to the Belgian Army. It's right in the middle of the battlefield that I'm talking about today. It's not the easiest place to reach. You reach it by a little very narrow dike road across what can be very, very wet and boggy farmland. But it's a pretty little place. It's surrounded by memorials to the Belgian units that fought here. And you can just about see my wife at the table, and we were visited by a cat that came out of the middle of nowhere when we were there last time. It's a place I go to every single time I'm in this area. It's a tiny little thing. I'm actually standing at the door there, looking into the chapel. I don't know, maybe 16 seats or something like that, and a small altar. But I'm drawn back by those lovely stained glass windows at the end of the chapel every time. Here's an example of one of them, illustrating the battlefield in which the chapel stands. It's very evocative, and I think it's a very fine piece of work. A couple of others here of Albert, King of the Belgians, and his wife Elizabeth, who were in a leadership position during the Great War. I'll come back to talk to them about them both a bit later, perhaps. But again, great piece of work, a lovely little chapel. And if you're in this area, the nearest large town is Dixmude. It's well worth going to see it. A very wonderful little place. The chapel was built next door to what is now a rather sanitized stump of a ruined church tower. So on the left there, you can see it. In recent years, it's had a wooden viewing platform built on the top of it, which personally I think has spoiled it a bit, but it does at least give you a better view when you get up there. The church, you can just about see on the left there, the church tower has been very badly damaged. And in fact, during the war, it was reduced gradually down to a small stump. In fact, that church and the little village surrounding it had been abandoned before the First World War, and the entire village uprooted to another one about 1.5 miles away. So that the church that was in ruins by the end of the war was actually out of use by 1914 at all. But it was turned into, fortified into a strong point occupied by the Belgian forces in this part of the battlefield. And it's a pretty evocative sort of place to see. Post-war photograph there of the chapel next to the stump of the church as it was. You can see it's been concreted in. Next to it is one of the marker stones marking the deepest German advance into Allied territory. It's a great little site to go to. But the reason for starting with that in the talk is if you go up onto that viewing platform, you encounter this little plate, which gives you directions to places, villages, trenches, and strong points around the area in which it stands. Now, most of these, if not all of these places, you will have never heard of. And many of them are very tiny indeed. And in fact, the places they're pointing to don't really exist anymore. They're battlefield features. But you can compare in Belgian military history these names to the sorts of things you might see on the Somme, Mametz, Montauban, Contalmaison, all that stuff. These are important spots. And for anyone who knows or studies this part of the battlefield, they pick out a very large number of the important places. It doesn't show you as far north as the Belgian North Sea coast. It's mainly the ones within about 4 or 5 miles of the spot, but well worth seeing to get an orientation if you do go there. So a map. Where the place that I've been looking at is just about here. Can you see my little pointer on the screen? I don't know if you can or not. Just to the west of Dixmude, across the Yser River. The battlefield I'm going to be talking about today is, broadly speaking, in that red box. The battlefield follows the River Yser from the coast past Newport, past Dixmude, turns inland. There's a junction with the canal going down to Ypres. So everything to the south of that, most of the British visitors on this talk will know well, if not very well. It's surprising, really, that once you get north of Steenstraat, you don't see that many British visitors at all. Certainly not on the battlefields. You see them coming up again when you get to the coast. But I've been here dozens and dozens of times, and most times I've never seen another British visitor looking around it. So hopefully the book and this bit of talk will enthuse you to go and have a look, because there is so much to see. And it's I find it of fascinating interest. So I titled the talk War Across the Water. So I better explain what I mean by the water. And to do that, I'm going to go right back to the beginning of the war. Talk about the Belgian Army to kick off with. Here's some of them marching into battle. Belgium, as a state, was in a unique position of being guaranteed by treaty to be neutral. Neutral, that is, should it ever come to conflict between the major powers in Europe. And neutrality makes life very difficult in terms of political and clearly military planning. And it was always known that at some point, Belgium, the state, was in danger of being invaded. But being in a position of neutrality, you couldn't really take steps to do anything that might be seen as provocation of invasion. And you couldn't really do much on your border area because of that. And over the decades, the Belgian notion of defense had largely centered itself on 3 major fortifications. At Liège and Namur on the River Meuse down in the south, and the larger fortification around the great port and city of Antwerp up in Flanders. Now, those fortresses had been built a long time ago in most cases. They'd not been maintained well. They weren't terribly modern. And they were manned by about 65,000 men, the vast majority of which were older garrison troops rather than young fighting quality men. But the Belgian army also had what it called a field army of 6 divisions, about 118,000 men. So not so different in size from the original British expeditionary force that went to France in August 14. The strategic dilemma for military planners in Belgium was how to deploy that field army. The army itself had also been neglected for decades, had been the subject of continual budget cuts and strife, had been the subject of numerous tinkering with the methods of persuading men to enlist. And we ended up with a mixture of a small number of regular troops, but mostly men who were conscripted. I'll go through this in a little bit of detail in the book, because the way this was changed around and who ended up in the army is quite fascinating. But suffice to say, when war comes and Germany begins to invade, Belgium has its 3 fortresses, it has 6 divisions. There is conflict right up to the very last minute about where to put those divisions and how to defend the country, especially as there was a perceived similar threat to invasion by France than Germany. But in the end, I suppose you'd say they were deployed in a compromised fashion in the middle of the country, ready to march in almost any direction. Belgium also had a system of armed local militia and gendarmerie sprinkled across the country, but again, small, underinvested, obsolete, if you like, in terms of its methods and equipment and so forth. But it also had a major problem. The whole army had a major problem. Because of financial stringency over such a long time, its armaments were out of date, obsolescent. Fairly recently, large orders for modern artillery had been placed, but they'd been given to Krupp in Germany. And of course, Krupp in Germany didn't deliver to Belgium, certainly by the time the war began. It was an army of very little mechanization. I'm sure you've seen photographs of dogs being used to haul machine guns and other paraphernalia. It relied entirely on the horse. Really, there were very few mechanized vehicles. So you got an army here that's not in great shape to withstand a large, highly mechanized modern army coming into its territory. And the fact that it fought so valiantly in 1914 is an incredible credit to it. Now, I'm going to end up on the left-hand side of this sheet, but it's important that we start on the right-hand side. When Germany invaded, the fortresses of Liège and Namur fell fairly quickly, not as quickly as Germany would have liked, but fairly quickly. The Belgian army fell back in accordance with its long-standing strategic plan on the fortress around Antwerp. But we're going to end up on the Yser here between Newport and Dixmude and Ypres. Now, the whole army, the ones that at least were left after the fall of Liège and Namur, and that included the Belgian 4th Division, which had escaped from Namur, got into France, got to the coast, got on a ships and was re-landed in Belgium. The Belgian army was now in Antwerp, besieged by Germany. Meanwhile, through the rest of Schlieffen Plan, the German army was wheeling down south into France, as you know. So we have the Belgian army bottled up in Antwerp by a German force. The Belgian army does strike out on a couple of occasions out of Antwerp, but is essentially besieged there. And it has latterly been joined by a small force of British Royal Naval and Marine troops who are deployed at Lille. But eventually, once the Germans bring up their very heaviest artillery and start attacking the outer fortress ring of Antwerp, a decision is taken to evacuate the army from Antwerp. And at the same time, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of civilians from the city and those who have fled to it from elsewhere also start moving west, crossing the river, moving westward. The British force that's at Lille joins in and also moves westward, but a large chunk of it ends up crossing into neutral Holland, where it is then kept for the remainder of the war. Gradually, over the next few days, the Belgian force is moving, not being particularly harassed by the Germans, who are keeping at a respectful distance. But by the 8th, 10th of October, they've reached the area north of Ghent, where now they're joined on the south side by the British 7th Division and 3rd Cavalry Division, which have been landed in the last few days. They're also joined by a force of French Marine troops there who are holding the bridges and so on, while the Belgians cross to the other side. The withdrawal continues, and by the 13th of October, they've reached the line from Ostend down to Torhout. The British 7th and 3rd and the French Marines are also moving westward. And by the 18th of October, the Belgian force has reached the Yser. Now, the Yser is pretty much the last geographic feature of any great distinction in Belgium before you reach the French border on the very left of this image. So it already, even before a battle begins there, as the Germans catch up and encounter the Belgians again, it starts to assume something of a symbolism. It's the last corner of Belgium. The name of the river Yser in Flemish or Dutch is iron. It's an iron river, iron as in defense and tough and so on. But by now, the original Belgian force from its fortresses and field army is already down to only 40% of what was there when the war began. So we have an exhausted, tattered, fragmented, less than half-size Belgian army than was the case just over a month ago. So there you go. In 3 minutes flat, we've skipped the entire first bit of the war and we've got them on the Yser. The French Marines that had been at Ghent have also fallen back, and they are now occupying the area east of Dixmude, where they will play a central part in the defense of that town over the next few weeks. The British 7th and 3rd Cavalry that had been at Ghent have also fallen back, and they are now at Ypres. I'm not going to talk about Ypres in this talk at all, really. But you know what happens once they are there. They start to initially dig in. They're then ordered to try to advance to Menin, and they strike an enormous force of Germans coming in the same direction, and battle ensues. Meanwhile, some more French forces have arrived finally in the area. So we're getting a buildup of French and British and Belgian forces forming something of a defensive line from the coast down to Ypres. So this is how the whole mobile phase of the war pans out in this north of Belgium, and we end up on the coast. Once the Germans advance in strength, for the next month, from 18th to 20th of October through to middle of November, we have two parallel major battles going on. The first Battle of Ypres down in the south, where the big black star is, but in parallel with it, we have the clash between Belgian and French and German forces along the river Yser, the Battle of the Yser. Exactly the same time, exactly the same ferocity. And you could argue, actually, from a geographic viewpoint, the Yser battle perhaps edges it in importance, because if Germany breaks through the Yser, it's in a position to outflank that entire Allied front in France and Belgium, and to advance along the coast towards Calais, Dunkirk, Boulogne, and really do some serious harm to the British abilities to supply a force in Europe. So lots of marching going on, lots of large forces going on, Belgian, French. Now, before I talk about the battle and what happens on the Yser, there's just a subject I want to touch on. This is a little village called Aizen, and it's just to the east of Dixmude. It was originally defended by some of those French forces who then fell back towards the river and the town of Dixmude. It's an absolutely typical West Flanders town. Big church, little square, linear development of housing and a few shops along the streets. Completely typical. In October 14, it was the scene of massacre. There had been stories that had been filtering across the country and being reported by the press internationally of German atrocities taking place in various towns and cities as they advanced across Belgium. Well, Aizen wasn't quite the same, but it had the same effect. Fighting began here while the population was still in place, and indeed the population had been swelled by hundreds, if not thousands, of refugees from the rest of the country who were here when the fighting began to the east of the village. And as the Germans broke into the village, they were herded into a brewery. Now the brewery's still there. You can see the date on there, 1830 something. I'm not sure whether any of that building is actually original at all, but that is what was the Kostenecke brewery in Aizen. It's now the Dolle Brouwers brewery. It still operates. You can go and have a look around it and you can buy their produce there. But hundreds of people were rounded up and forced into shelter, into this brewery, where they were essentially bottled up without food, water, supplies of any kind for an awfully long time. As people inevitably tried to leave it, certain of them were arrested, certain of them were murdered. It's a dreadful, dreadful scene going on at the same time as the battle we're talking about here. Apart from memorials at the church and a mass grave in the churchyard, there's very little to mark this event in the village itself. But it always strikes me as something to remember at the same time of this battle. And it's actually a good reminder. Many times I talk to people about the Great War, and they always come to how futile it was and why did we bother? This is why we bothered. You weren't dealing with an invading enemy that was going to be kind and gentle to you. You were dealing with an invading enemy that, when it wanted to, was going to round you up and murder you. So this is another little place you should put when you're visiting this area. Even if you only go to buy a bottle of beer and have a look around it, it's worth remembering what was going on here at the same time as the military stuff we're talking about. Aizen, the village itself, inevitably is destroyed during the fighting and later in the war, and is rebuilt, and it's a pleasant little spot now. Now, I'm not going to go in detail about the first battle of the Yser. Suffice to say that this rather battered, fragmented Belgian army, supplemented by recently arrived French forces, is attacked by an overwhelmingly larger force. You can see all the black arrows on there. They're German divisions. Many of them are fresh reserve divisions that have been brought up, including the ones that advanced through Langemark. You'll be well familiar with that in the northern part of the Ypres salient. They bash against the defenses east of the river Yser to begin with. They force withdrawal across the Yser to the west. And eventually, more by luck than anything else, the Germans get a foothold on the western side of the river Yser, near the village of Terwate, which is north of Dixmude. And that, of course, is a crucial moment, because once the Germans are across the Yser, the last significant defensible geography, then the Allied forces have got a problem. So there's our three places again: Newport, Dixmude, Ypres. And I'm going to just talk a little bit about another one called Ramskapelle, which is just where that red dot is. At the northern end of the battlefield area here is Newport. And at Newport, the river flows out to the sea, but it's also joined at that spot by a number of other waterways. It comes under enormous attack along the coastal road and along the other roads you can see coming up through Mannekensveer and Terwate there, against this position. So you have a very small French and Belgian force holding this spot. And the entire thing is becoming incredibly critical when it begins to unfold that one of the ways to stop any further German advance is to inundate the area, to flood it. Now, this is not something that is new. Parts of Belgium and parts of northern France have been flooded before deliberately for this kind of purpose, but not for quite a long time. And it's not something you decide to do very easily, especially letting salt water into good agricultural land. It's not something you do readily. But the action that does take place to flood the land is taken, is highly successful. It's helped by the fact that there is a railway, which I've marked in that sort of khaki color, running in a straight line from Newport down to Dixmude. And that railway runs on a not very high embankment. In other words, it can form a barrier to floodwater. So if you're able to raise the level of water around the river Yser and stop up any gaps under that embankment, then you have got the possibility of flooding the area between the railway and the river. And that would, of course, be a very significant problem for any force trying to advance. So in desperation, as this heavy German attack is hitting the whole line of the Yser, has already broken across it in one place and looks set fair to break through at Newport as well, it all begins. So here we have the deployment of forces just about as this flooding is about to start. You'll see it's a mixture of Belgians and French holding the railway line. Newport is being held by French, a group. Then there's some Belgian troops, 2nd Division. Then there's a French group. Then there's Belgians and so on. So if you see things about the Battle of the Yser and it's a Belgian battle, well, no, it isn't really. It's both. It's without the French troops being there, the Belgian troops could not possibly have held that line. And Dixmude itself, which is held by a mixture of mainly French troops around the east of the town there. Now, I've got a modern map here, and again, I've highlighted the railway in that brownish khaki color coming down there. But the reason for putting this on is one thing that strikes you about that map is how much light blue there is on it. Not only the river Yser coming up on the right-hand side there, but this whole area is absolutely crisscrossed by small canals, drainage ditches around the fields, and so on. It is an incredibly complex set of waterways, all linked up to the extent where, even in peacetime, that set of waterways needed to be managed. There's a whole structure of managing these things organizationally. And to a large extent, the thinking about how to flood this area comes from that existing waterways management organization. You will read lots of things about the flooding, but it's worth picking out 4 of the key figures that drove it, in no particular order. You have a guy called Prudent Nauten, who interestingly is from Ypres. He's a fairly senior general headquarters staff officer, goes to see Karel Kocher. Now, Karel Kocher is high up in the waterway management thing, knows all about these waterways and how to manage them and how to flood them if necessary. You have on the right-hand side a Belgian engineering unit, Captain Robert Thijs here and his men, who are fundamentally the ones that make the flooding happen ultimately. But the thinking about we need to do it comes from Nauten, the how to do it comes from Kocher, and a local man who knows the spot. He knows all the waterways around Ypres, Henrik Gereert. So, you know, 4 key figures. You can read these things, different accounts tell you different things about who was making decisions, who was doing what, but fundamentally, these are the 4 men that make it happen and are genuine heroes in my book. But it's worth just a second thinking about what on earth, how this water came to be. At low tide, the North Sea is lower than the ground of West Flanders. In other words, West Flanders doesn't flood at low tide. Its rivers and streams can flow out to the sea, no problem at all, normal stuff. However, at high tide, and bearing in mind the rise and fall of the tide here is quite a lot. This is actually from this January. You have a 5-meter rise and fall between low tide and high tide. In other words, the difference between my two light blue boxes is 5 meters. At high tide, the sea is above ground level. And that's bad news. The way this is managed is that over the centuries, the Belgians have built sea defenses, in other words, sea walls and what have you, along more or less the entire coast. And wherever water meets the sea, there are a series of different locks and sluices that control the water level. In other words, you enable rivers to continue to flow out, or at least not to rise too badly when you close these things off, but you don't let the sea in. So that's the normal sort of peacetime setup. And when decisions are taken to flood the land east of that railway, it is by a process of playing about with those locks and sluices for the right tides, for the moon, for the wind and what have you. And if you do it right, you will cause those rivers and streams to rise. That is the way it works. The problem is that those locks and sluices, the key ones, are under fire by the time this comes about. German infantry is not too far away. German artillery is certainly close enough to plaster Newport and all of those waterways around it. You'll see that the Yser comes in from the east, but there's also a lot of other light grey wiggly things, which are canals and various streams coming from inland, and they meet together at Newport in this strange junction, which is often called the Goose Foot. And it's called the Goose Foot clearly because it looks a bit like the leg and foot of a goose coming in from the left there. And playing about with the locks and sluices, there are various things tried over various days, but the key aspect is if you play around with one of those sluices, you will cause this stream called the Noordvaart to rise. And by causing the Noordvaart to rise, you will flood the land around it. There it is today. That's the Goose Foot today. The key area for playing around is that one that I've arrowed. The Germans are over on your left-hand side, shelling all of that area. And the fact that men did this over several days, going out under fire into this pretty exposed position to play around with these locks and sluices is an act of considerable bravery. They did so initially without the right tools because the lock keepers had fled and taken their tools with them. They didn't have the right keys and things to open the locks up. So it was all a bit experimental, but eventually they got it to work over several days. Now I'm going to skip inland to Ramskapelle, which is my little red dot, because Ramskapelle was really the deepest penetration that the Germans made. This little windmill is perhaps not the most glorious of war memorials, but it is a war memorial. And not only that, it marks the deepest penetration of the German forces across the Yser during the battle. They reached a windmill just outside the village of Ramskapelle, and this marks it. There it is, there's the windmill. It was a bit bashed about. Little map, village in German hands by the time this takes place. The 42nd and 52nd Reserve Infantry have captured it. They've reached the mill. They're actually, you'll see, across to the west of the railway line. A counterattack is put together, Belgian and French forces, and they counterattack. They regain the mill. They regain the middle of Ramskapelle. But at least in part, if you read the German accounts of it, it is because by that time, by the time the counterattack is clearing the village again, the German forces are operating under 1.5 meters of water. So everything to the east of the railway is now in floodwater and rising. And to make life worse, it is raining heavily. In other words, the floodwater and the torrential rain falling is making the situation untenable. Germans cannot hold on to Ramskapelle. In fact, they cannot hold on to the ground east of the railway line either. They have to get back towards the river. So key moment in First Battle of the Yser is this capture and then recapture of Ramskapelle. And when that happens, the entire area is flooding to the extent where no further large-scale attacks like that can take place. In other words, it's a decisive outcome. This is the back of Ramskapelle railway station. It's slightly later date, but you start to get the impression here. Here's the what becomes the inundated battlefield, no man's land, to the left of it. Parts of the railway station are still there. You can go and see them. They've been concreted in during the war, and no doubt later. There are some very hopeless mannequins and things trying to make it look as though it's occupied, and they've bits of barbed wire up, but you know, okay, that's for the tourists. The actual building is still there to a little bit, so you can trace exactly where you are. A couple of aerial photographs. So the water has risen. Here you can see in the middle of this one, this is later on, the town of Newport below you at the bottom of the screen there is devastated. By then it's been shelled to hell. So it's probably 1917 or even 1918. But you can see the Goose Foot right in the middle, and you can see the various waterways coming into it from the right and the extent of the flooding beyond it. You can see the coast up on the top left, which is held by German forces. Here's another one a bit further down. You start to get this impression of a vast area underwater. I'll just pick out, there's the railway line. So you can see south towards us, bottom of the picture, there is no flooding. You've got this wiggly line coming in, which is one of the streams. But north of the railway, on this picture, at least east of it geographically, you can see these large areas of floodwater, but not entirely underwater. You know, slightly higher areas are dry. Beyond it, you've got the river Yser, which is twisting away into the distance. So on the railway line, which is now the Belgian and French front line, here, a deep no man's land, mainly full of water, the river Yser, the German front line. And that's the way things stay until 1918. So what we've got here is a different kind of front. This is not like the Somme. It's not even like Ypres. It's certainly not like Vimy Ridge. It's not like the Champagne. This is totally different. You have a fixed and dead straight front line on the railway embankment. You have this patchwork of flooded water. I think this map was 1916, if I remember rightly. So you've got flood water of varying heights in the middle. And then you've got the river Yser on the right, which is, and you can see some German trenches in red there. So it's a pretty different form of battlefield, and a few photographs to illustrate it. One thing you get, of course, when you flood an area is anything higher sticks out of the water. And here and there, farms, whole villages and buildings are sticking out of the water. And they become defensible points. Some of them are fortified and become key strong points, sticking out in the water in no man's land. And in the early days, the only way of getting towards these things was by boat. So you've got detachments of men going out on both sides from their front lines out to various points in the water. This, you know, I don't know what became of this one. I don't even know what it is, but it's a little farmhouse, obviously, on a slightly higher patch of ground, detachment of men sent out by boat to stay there. And bear in mind that every single one of these points in the water is known, is marked on a map, and is subject to artillery fire. I don't think I'd fancy being in one of them, because the enemy knows exactly where I am. I think our good friend Bart provided me with that photograph when I was hunting around for things. Another feature that begins to happen over time is that the various strong points are linked up by wooden walkways, pasarelas they're called. Now again, I don't think I'd fancy being sent out to take rations to a frontline post in the water down one of these things, thank you very much, because there are guys on the other side of that photograph wearing a different uniform who can watch me doing it. It's an absolutely incredible, unique battlefield. The front lines themselves, here's a Belgian sector, begin to resemble the trench line systems of elsewhere. In other words, you've got initially sandbagged, later concreted, barbed wire, wiggly trenches, dugouts, and all the rest of it along the railway embankment and along the river line. And then you've got this vast sheet of water between the two. It's amazing, amazing geography. There's another one a bit further behind. You'll find lots of photographs of these floods in all sorts of places. And it always looks a bit desolate. I don't know what this must have done to men's morale to be in this area for any considerable length of time, but it can't have been great. This is a much later photograph, but simply because of where it is. It's a Belgian post at Lauchem. Now, Lauchem wasn't recaptured until October 17, so it dates later. The front lines are in the same place from October 14 to September 18, more or less, in all of the area. But something interesting happens on the Belgian side. The army, which was obsolete, obsolescent, undermanned, and then reduced by the fighting of August through to October 14, amazingly is rebuilt. And not only rebuilt, it expands beyond its original size to be bigger. And you say, how do you do that when most of your country has been captured? Well, the Belgian authorities managed to recruit 125,000 men during the war years. And that was from about 25,000 Belgian men who had one way or another managed to escape across into the neutral Netherlands. Men who were elsewhere, many of whom had been in the Belgian Congo and other territories, or, you know, they were overseas someplace. And they found 125,000 men. In other words, more men were recruited than had been in the original field army when the war began. It was an incredible feat, incredible feat. Many of these men went into the field army. Of course, some went into an air force, what have you, but many went into a field army. And the army grew from its original 6 divisions to 10. Amazing. I find this extraordinary. You've got a little triangle of Belgium still in Belgian hands, and yet you're still able to generate this growth of the army. It's also helped by the fact that King Albert took a very cautious view about expending his men. There is no point, if you are holding on to the last bit of your territory, in throwing those men away in fruitless attacks that are not going to strategically succeed. I think he must have driven the Allies mad, because they continually asked for Belgian assistance in certain operations, and the Belgians were always reluctant if it meant to do so would be at a high cost. So conservation of men plays a part in the regrowth of the Belgian army as well. Initially, having lost virtually everything they've got, the Belgians are re-equipped with everything: uniform, munitions, supplies, rations, you name it, by France and Britain initially. But gradually, the Belgian government in exile in France develops a whole national network of supply. It builds and it mans factories in Britain and in France to supply its own forces. Now, many of you on this call being English, you may well know about the Belgian factories in England, especially a large one called Elizabethville up in County Durham, for instance, employing thousands of people, making munitions and equipment of all sorts for the Belgian Army. Now, the Belgian Army never became fully self-supplying through the war, but to a very great extent, it did recover that position. And again, I find this really intellectually very interesting. The fact that you've lost your homeland, but you're able to develop your forces and to supply them from elsewhere. It's a feat. And because of all of that stuff, because the army's getting bigger, stronger, it's enabled to extend the front that it holds. So those elements that were held by French forces, the French are relieved to go and fight elsewhere. The Belgians take over certain sectors as they go. And so one of the effects you get out of this long static period of fighting across the water and the regrowth of the Belgian forces is that you get a development of a much deeper defensive position. So this is again 1917, I think. It's actually the area around the Belgian chapel, which was in the middle of the screen here. But you can see the straight railway line being the front line on the left here, but behind it, you start to get a second and third line of trench systems. You get strong points being built. You get medical facilities being built, going back several miles, several kilometers west of the Belgian line here. You get a similar thing going on in Germany. You get the second and third defensive line, part of the Flanders line being constructed here. And you get the gradual strengthening of those various posts that are sticking out in the water, which you can see as sort of little dots and things in blue or red in the water, linked up by these wooden walkways. So you're getting the development of a very intriguing battlefield here. So what takes place? Well, it has to be said that in the middle part of this battlefield, where the water is highest and most persistent, not much happens in terms of direct fighting. There's artillery firing at each other, but of course you don't get the ability to get up and put your bayonet on and advance. The fighting takes place around the water. There's my rectangle, which is my crude approximation of where the flooded area is. Of course, the first large-scale battle after the flooding takes place, Second Battle of Ypres, down there, big red star. French and Belgian forces, of course, are involved in the northern part of that battle around Steenstraat and up towards Merkem. So major battle. Third Battle of Ypres, of course, later on, more or less the same place, edging its way eastward. In between, you have the idea that to support the offensive that becomes Third Ypres, the British will take over the Newport sector. They will advance along the coast and they'll do all sorts of wonderful things like landing tanks on the beaches. But the Germans strike first in Operation Strandfest, which really puts a big wobbly into British ambition up in that area and destroys 2 British battalions in a day. So you can see these things are not across the water at all. They're taking place around the flanks of the water. But there is some fighting in and around the water. Coincident with the latter parts of Third Ypres, as the British are edging towards Passchendaele, there is a very smart operation by French and Belgian forces that advances across floodwater to capture the village of Merkem, which stands on slightly higher ground. I was going to talk about this in detail, but I haven't got time. It's in the book, but it's well worth reading about because this really is an advance through the water. They cross at a place called Langewade, across flooded water, on foot where they can. It's an extraordinary operation, but Merkem is captured. At the same time, and one I am going to talk about, there are some large-scale raids at Dixmude on a feature known as the Minotaur. In March 18, coincident with the major German attack on the Somme, there is a German attack across the southern end of the inundated area, actually at the very area where the Belgian chapel is. The defenses in that area are called the Grote Wacht. They are captured. The Belgians counterattack and recapture them. This is again going on in inundated floodwater area. And in April 18, coincident with the Battle of the Lys, not so further south, and written about in my books on said Battle of the Lys, the Belgians defend Merkem against strong German attack and defeat it utterly. So you start to get the signs by 1918, the fruits of this Belgian re-equipment, re-strengthening, because by April 18, this is a force that knows what it's doing and is capable of doing it. And in September 1918, when the final offensive strikes out of Ypres, it is by the British Second Army and the Belgian Army. The Belgian Army, for instance, recaptures the village of Passchendaele at that time. So you've got a pretty capable outfit in the Belgian Army by 18. So you'll see there large-scale fighting, apart from a couple of those actions, isn't in that water area for obvious reasons, but some of them are. And I'm going to talk about a couple of raids that are genuinely across water, not across the floodwater, but across the river. This is at Dixmude. Dixmude has been defended in 1914 by the French Marines and others, but it's been captured. And in capturing it, the Germans come up to the river where they find this industrial building complex, the one in the background of this postcard. It's an industrial flour mill, an oil mill. Tall brick and concrete buildings. There are chimney stacks. There's machinery and all sorts of stuff. It's known as the Minotaur. Next to it on this postcard is the road bridge going from Dixmude on the left across to Kaskerke on the right and then up to Newport. I'm standing at the top of the Yser Tower, which I'll talk about in a minute here. Looking down, there's nothing left of this Minotaur now. In fact, the area that it occupies is some very swanky housing, and the riverboats parked up alongside them. It's quite a pleasant area to walk around, but it was there. Now, Minotaur, my red arrow at the bottom, being taller, even though shell fire starts to bring these buildings down, it never brings it down fully. And if you stand on top of the Minotaur, you have all of a sudden an incredibly good view across the river, across the Belgian lines. You get a view of that area. You can see everything that's going on there. And it extends up to an interesting spot in the Belgian front line that is, in French, the Boyau de la Mort, or the Dodengang in Flemish, the Trench of the Dead. And you can see on the map that the red Belgian front line follows the line of the river. There is then a break, and then you have the blue German front line on the same bank of the river. In other words, that little gap between the two is a very uncomfortable no man's land indeed. And not only that, from the Minotaur, you can be observed and fired at from the back. So if you're in that trench of death, it is a very exposed spot indeed. And in fact, everywhere in that yellow bounded area is under German observation and fire. So if you can capture or knock out the Minotaur, you do yourself a big favor in terms of your ability to defend the west bank of the Yser. Here's the area today. I'm actually standing at the Trench of Death site, which has been preserved. And in the distance, you can see the rebuilt town hall of Dixmude. In the distance is the site of Minotaur, and there's the Yser Tower that I was standing onto look down at the houses. The river's wider now in this area than it was before, but it gives you a good impression that if someone's on that Minotaur with a good pair of binoculars, you're standing where I'm standing, they're not that far away, they're going to see you, and then suddenly you're going to find a 5.9 shell landing on you. The Trench of Death is worth going to see, although I personally I find it a little bit I don't know, a bit artificial. It's actually it's the same layout and the same spot and everything, but all the sandbags you see are concrete, and you know it's for walking up and down and getting an impression rather than pretending to be real. Worth going to. And at the end of it, very near the end of it anyway, in that gap between there and the German trenches, there's a sort of model of a couple of large petroleum tanks that were there before the war. They were soon in ruins, of course, and they became the epicenter of quite a lot of no man's land fighting and raiding in between. So they are another death trap area. So it is worth going to this area, walking around it, having a look at the concrete trenches, yes, but it's also worth walking up and down the river line to see this landscape, and you suddenly start to get the idea that of how exposed the Belgian forces holding this spot were. Gradually, the Minotaur is reduced by shell fire. It comes down, it comes down. Here's a typical postcard, German. The enemy is 40 meters away. Well, the enemy in this case is Belgian, and they're across the river. And we're in an oil mill, and you can see some of the machinery from the mill, but the Germans have concreted it. They've made it into an absolute strong point. Not only a strong point, a complex of strong points. My map on the left there, main German trenches around the middle of Dixmude, snaking around the Minotaur on the riverbank, facing the Belgian front opposite. You know, just a matter of yards away, but with a river in the middle of it. Now, in 1916, the Belgians had started to think about recapturing Dixmude and how that might be done, and they continued to do this thinking into early 17. Planned to carry out a kind of pincer attack on it and then circle it, but all calculations about the artillery you needed to do that meant it was way beyond their resource, absolutely way beyond, and the idea was shelved, but kind of morphed into the idea of a large-scale raid on the Minotaur. And in fact, two took place at the same time as the last phase of Third Battle of Ypres begins. There's a bit of detail about this in the book, but it's an extraordinary operation because, you know, relatively small network of strong points around this Minotaur building. Just look at the force that's deployed to get there. There is a specially selected and specially trained infantry force of a couple of Belgian line regiments. So they've taken good, fit, young guys. They've trained them in all the raiding techniques and hand grenades and all the rest of it. Belgian field artillery is massed to support this and fire a box barrage around it. But we bring up 14 batteries of British siege artillery. It's an enormous force of artillery, including, I think it was 2 of the 15-inch railway guns that they brought up for this thing, which could, you know, you could blow up the entire town of Dixmude with these things. It's an incredible explosive force. And 3 and a bit companies of the British Royal Engineers Special Companies, in other words, the poison gas specialists, because the way this is going to work is that gas is going to be laid down, a barrage is going to be laid down on the Minotaur to box it off and keep everybody's heads down. And the trained Belgian troops are going to lay a bridge down the Minotaur, kill all the Germans they can find in there, take any information they can find, and then get out. This is not to capture the Minotaur, this is just to do damage to it. An incredible force for it, incredible. Part of that force, Z Company, builds one of these things you might have seen a TV program about a few years ago, one of these huge static flamethrowers. There's a picture of it at the bottom there. I don't know whether you can fully see it, but on the left, there are these sort of fuel tanks and pumps and God knows what makes this thing work. And it squirts out this gigantic, tens of yards long flame. And one of these is built and is fired across the river at the same time as these poor Belgian guys are building these plank bridges to get across the river. The gas doesn't work terribly well. The artillery does. They do get the bridge across the river. They do get into the Minotaur, but the fighting is incredibly confused. Doesn't last very long. They lose some men and they come out again. And then they essentially do the whole thing the second time around, but with less gas, and it's a little bit more successful. Extraordinary operation. Nothing like it on any part of the British front. Crossing a river like that, nothing that I can think of. But the Minotaur holds, Dixmude holds, and it eventually only falls in 1918 as part of the final offensive advance. But what an operation that is. So, real quick summary of everything that went on there. If you take the Belgian army that fought in Europe as opposed to Africa, 378,000 men in total served, 26,000 killed in action, which is a proportion not terribly different from Great Britain, Germany, France, a few percentage points smaller maybe. 14,000 died of sickness or missing. Strange categorization, but that's the way the Belgians expressed it in 1921. 237,000 wounded, of which about a third were so severely wounded they couldn't return to action. So these are not small numbers. The killing rate was highest in 1914 and 1918 in the static, mobile periods, of course, sorry. 14% in 1915, mainly to do with Second Battle of Ypres. Relatively small numbers in 16 and 17 because of the static nature of warfare here. There was no major battle going on. There were these raids and shell fire, but nothing huge. But then you have to balance against that Belgian civilian deaths. It's reckoned that there are nearly 9,000 Belgians killed as a direct consequence of the conflict, either through shell fire or air raids or being murdered. But it's estimated something like getting on for 80,000 people died a premature death as a result of poor nutrition and all the other things that go with occupation. So not small numbers, and civilian numbers being higher than the Belgian military losses is a very sad feature. A few quick photographs to enthuse you to go. There are a number of Belgian military cemeteries in the area. They were all based on plots that were created during the war, but were all greatly expanded after the war by bringing in bodies from elsewhere. Standard headstone design, details of the man in his native language. I always find them quite pleasant, well laid out spaces. Churchyards in the area behind the lines often have military burials. There's a particular one where they've got examples of all three, British, French, and Belgian troops buried in a churchyard. Every village, every town has got its memorials. They are very interesting. I researched quite a few of the men on these things as part of the book. Belgian military records are quite good for personnel. You can find out quite a lot of these guys. In fact, quite a lot of it you can find online. And what I do love is a lot of these village cemeteries have these little enamel photographs of the men, which is great stuff. Well worth seeing. Dotted around the Yser battlefield as well, you have these things called Albertina memorials. They are modern, they're 1980s. They were put up in 3 phases, and they are to mark important battlefield spots. This one happens to be at Lauchem, which was recaptured with Markham. There are regimental and only 2 divisional memorials to the Belgian forces. They're exactly what you'd expect. They're very similar to British and French unit memorials. Talks of their history, talks of their actions during the war, sometimes lists men and what have you. This happens to be the 3rd Division's order of battle, I guess you'd call it. But there are other places too, lots of places. For an area that's probably only 20 miles long by 5 or 6 miles deep, it keeps you going for days. I mean, there are lots and lots of places to see. This happens to be in the background a presbytery, not presbytery, no, an ecclesiastical building attached to a church in the village of Houten. The building was used as Belgian military headquarters for a good chunk of the war. There's an excellent photograph of King Albert exiting the building, sentries there and everything. You can imagine the dispatch riders coming up and down and all the rest of it. It's a beautiful little spot today. It faces the churchyard, and in the churchyard is here is one of his chiefs of staff who died of illness in the middle of the war, and there's his grave. And there are photographs of, you know, military funeral going on around it. There are lots of places, hospitals out on the coast, big one called the Ocean Hospital, plaques to it. There's tons of places to go. You can see I'm very enthusiastic about this area. It's worth seeing. But one of the things that's of most interest, not only because it's horrible, brutal architecture, are the 2 Yser towers built just near Dixmude. The original one on the left was blown up because this is a scene of considerable nationalist strife between Flemish people and Walloon people. In other words, the Flemish-speaking and French-speaking Belgians. The politics of memory in Belgium is incredibly complex, and an investment of time in trying to get a bit of understanding of it before you go is well worth it, because you start to get a grasp of what these symbols mean, the AVVVK and the bird symbol and the bits of poetry you see around. They are mainly driven by a Flemish nationalist trend, and it leads to things being done the way they are. It's most interesting. Once the original tower was blown up, it was decided to build an even larger tower behind it. Now, that tower is a fantastic viewing platform, but it's also a museum to the Belgian Army and to the battles of this area, and it is well worth going to see. The whole site is worth seeing, but I do urge you to get a bit of that understanding. For instance, there is a crypt around the lower tower where many of the Flemish heroes were taken for reburial. And you don't get why are they there? What's all that about until you go through some of that stuff. It's like a talk in its own right, that. But if you're going to go, you'll see this tower from everywhere. I originally thought, and I still think, that from a architectural viewpoint, it's absolutely horrible, but it's on a great spot. It's worth going to, and it's a very good landmark when you're traveling around, get your bearings. And the whole of the railway line that was there as the Belgian front line is no longer a railway line. It's been turned into a cycle and walking path, which you'll see the signs of Frontzaten going along it. And you'll see out into the inundated areas, and with the odd book and the odd map, you'll figure out which farm was a strong point and which one wasn't there before and all the rest of it. Nothing to look at, but I find this area curiously beautiful. It's got an atmosphere and a charm of its own, and I think it repays a bit of time. There you go. That's it.